Hello, thank you for coming to my talk. I am Aaron A. Reed. If my name sounds vaguely familiar, you might know me from any of these projects. I started out writing parser interactive fiction maybe 15 years ago now, maybe a little more if I think about that, which I don't want to. I ended up writing a book on Inform 7, which Graham Nelson is speaking about simultaneously to my infinite sadness. That's how it works. More recently, I've been doing kind of more experimental games, kind of probing at like what interactive narrative can do in different ways. I also spent quite a while in academia, so this talk will have citations, beware. Most recently, I've been working with Spirit AI on Character Engine, which is a product that's trying to make kind of more dynamic NPC characters for game studios to use. And I'm also the co-author of an upcoming book with John Murray and Anastasia Salter on kind of the lasting legacy of the adventure game genre. Called Adventure Games Playing the Outsider. It's coming early next year, and as you can see, we do not have cover art yet. But if you follow my work at all, you might have noticed that my most recent project was not a digital game. It was a tabletop role-playing game called Archives of the Sky. And specifically on the cover, this is called a story game. What do I mean by this? Well, this term has been used by a lot of people over the years to talk about a lot of different kinds of things. To my knowledge, it was first used by Marianne Buckles in 1985 to talk about the original text game Adventure, which is kind of the great ancestor of many of the games we're here talking about today. But what I use this term to mean is this. A story game for me is a playable narrative experience in which both the rules of the game and the content of the story must be understood in order to advance. So this obviously includes a wide swath of digital games, but not all of them, even not all digital games that have story. So yes, interactive fiction, like the original Adventure, you have to understand sort of both the rules about movement and object manipulation to make progress through this. But you also have to understand narrative things, right? Like that a thirsty plant might want water, or that you need some serious leverage to open a giant clam. On the other hand, Opus Magnum, which is a fantastic game and does in fact have a story about a haughty alchemist who kind of becomes a political revolutionary, is not really a story game by my definition because you can totally ignore that story and it doesn't impede your progress through the game. It's kind of optional, right? You don't need to understand those two things together. Interestingly though, this definition also includes a lot of analog story games. But instead of analog story games, I actually want to call these something else for this talk. I want to call them collaborative story games. So these are story games with two additional caveats. They're story games in which the participants are involved in creating at least some of the story content, and where that creation is mediated by systems, rules, right, designed to make the story compelling. So you might be thinking, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Dungeons and Dragons, right? Tabletop role-playing games with dice determining outcomes and a game master who creates a story and then lets the players play through it. And I am definitely talking about those. We'll talk a bit about D&D in this talk. But if you read the talk description, you might be thinking, oh, actually, he's talking about these games. These are these weird indie role-playing games that have come out lately. Thank you, yes. A lot of times these games have no dice, they have no game master, and yet they're still systems to help people collaborate to tell a story together. And I definitely am talking about these games too, and we'll talk about a couple of these specifically in this talk. But I want to posit that the space of collaborative story games is actually broader than even this. And I want to talk about this game. Tales of the Crystals was released in 1993 by Milton Bradley. Thank you, whoever wooed this game. So in this game, a group of players are listening to an audio cassette tape that's telling a story set in a magical fantasy kingdom. But at certain times, usually about every 3 or 4 minutes, the characters need your help. You're playing the Keepers of the Crystals, who are these sort of powerful heroes. Each has a certain focus of magical power. And what happens is that the tape will narrate a problem that needs resolving in this magical kingdom, like a captured unicorn or some meddlesome fairies, describe some sort of particulars of the situation, including complications or maybe some potential things that could be part of a solution. But then it asks you to stop the tape and come up with your own solution to this problem using your character's specific abilities. Unlike other games from this period with audio or videotapes, there's no game board or fixed rules for how to do that. The players can just make up whatever solution they want through an open discussion. When the tape starts up again, it cannot, of course, respond to the solution the players came up with, but it also doesn't contradict it. The story just kind of continues with the problem being resolved without ever mentioning particulars of how that came about. It lets the player's story that they created coexist with its own. So this game isn't very well known, but I love that it exists because it shows that the space of collaborative story games is actually really broad. It's more than just kind of the stereotype we might have of tabletop role-playing games and the kinds of people we think of stereotypically as playing them, right? It doesn't have a game master or dice or an elaborate book filled with story prompts and art, and yet its rules are still helping players shape an emergent story. And it also kind of challenges the boundaries between analog and digital anyway, right? So like a cassette tape with a fixed voice that can't respond to you at all sounds sort of primitive until you think, well, that's a cutscene, right? Like, in a lot of ways, that's exactly the same tech we have in like the latest, huge AAA RPG. So in this talk, I'm going to propose that all kinds of story games, analog and digital, driven by complex AI or running on cassette tapes, are part of a shared design space and have things to say to each other. Specifically, I think digital story games could stand to do a lot more listening to all of the weird, interesting experiments being done in other spaces. While the folks here at Narrascope are probably an exception, digital story games, especially big mainstream ones, are often kind of stuck with a handful of relatively simple models for how story can be interactive that are often kind of rigid, unwelcoming to player creativity, and hard to innovate from within or evolve. So that's my introduction. I'm going to talk about what's, I think, a minimally effective collaborative story game. I'm going to talk about, a metaphor I really like, which is the wunderkammer, and explain what that means. I'm going to talk about 4 kind of core activities in collaborative story games that I have, that to me kind of seem like the most important things people do when they play these games. And for each of those, kind of give an example of a game that I think exemplifies that point. And then I'm going to talk about some lessons that digital game makers can take from these games. So I want to start by talking about a collaborative story game that is a cool game, but I think doesn't quite work to its intended purpose. This was one of the first collaborative story games that wasn't explicitly a tabletop role-playing game that I think I ever played. Incredibly, this is 25 years old now, which is hard for me to believe. So in this game, the player has a hand of fairy tale tropes. So there are things like ring, beautiful, forest, witch, and so on. And also some cards that are endings to fairy tales. So the rightful ruler was placed once more on the throne, right? And what you're doing when you're playing this game is you're trying to tell a story that includes all of the elements you have in your hand, putting them down as you bring them into the story. But if you mention an element that someone else has in their hand, they can play that card to steal control of the story and then try to direct it towards the ending card that they have. So if you've played this, you can probably attest that it's a lot of fun, there's a lot of laughter, it's a good time. But the stories that emerge out of Once Upon a Time aren't really super coherent or satisfying to take away from the game. I hear some knowing laughter. And this is basically because the rules don't really encourage you to tell a good story in any meaningful way. They say you should avoid, quote, avoid saying things that are foolish or contradictory, but the mechanics don't really help you do that. And in fact, by pitting players against each other for working towards different endings, the rules are actually actively discouraging collaboration or working together to keep things coherent. So you get stories that like keep lurching in wildly different directions as each new person takes control of them. So how can rules actually help with this problem, right? And I want to turn to a much more obscure game. In fact, it's so obscure it doesn't even have a name. And the author had forgotten about it and I think was mildly startled when I wrote about it in my dissertation. And the author of that game is Andrew Plotkin, who's one of the organizers here of Narrascope. So this is a game that he designed for the Mist Online forums. Did anyone play that or Uru back when those services were live? Okay, so you might remember there were kind of like long waits for content while that game was in progress. And the people on the forums had kind of needed to find ways to amuse themselves. So Zarf came up with this game, which was designed to be a play-by-post game on the forums. And in this game, 2 players are each alternating posts. One of them is playing a modern-day explorer of a mysterious ruined age who finds a journal. And the other player is playing an inhabitant of that age at its prime, back in the past. And the conceit is that the modern-day explorer and the original inhabitant are sort of alternating entries in this same journal. So the past and the present kind of going back and forth. The players aren't supposed to coordinate outside of the journal entries they write, so there's no metagaming talking about where the story's going or anything. The players in this game each have start with 10 white and 1 black kind of virtual stones, because this is a forum game. And what these are for is when you write a journal entry on your turn, you can spend up to 3 white stones to highlight certain elements in your entry that you are saying by spending white stones in them are going to be narratively significant. So this is kind of like Chekhov's gun, if you know that analogy. You're saying that I mentioned this tree stump, but by spending a white stone, I'm saying this tree stump has actually become important to the plot, and I'm signaling that to my collaborator. The other player is playing some white stones here. These elements that have been introduced kind of go into a shared space. So after they've been introduced, it doesn't really matter who introduced them. you can gain a black stone by tying two of these elements together and kind of resolving them. So if there was one element that's a mysterious noise and another that's an abandoned machine, you could get a black stone by writing in your journal entry that actually that machine was causing that weird noise, right? And those two things have now been sort of resolved. You can also spend a black stone, to bring something that's been resolved back into the story. Basically saying there's actually more to this. We're not done with that narratively. And when you do this, the other player has to be the one to resolve it. You can't do that and then resolve that yourself. The other thing you can do with black stones is you can spend two of them to contradict something the other player has written. And when you do that, they on their next turn have to explain why they were mistaken in their original journal entry about what's actually happened in the world. So play sort of continues with players spending white stones, gaining black stones until they have no white stones left and all of the story elements have been resolved together, and then the game is over. So what I find really fascinating about this is that it turns a writing exercise into a story game. So the mechanics are helping you tell a good story in a way that once upon a time are not as effective at, in my opinion. So the limited number of stones is providing an approximate length of the story and a way of estimating your position through it. So if you've spent 5 white stones, you know you're about halfway through the story, and that's helpful for sort of like, flow and pacing. Players start with equal numbers of stones, so it's distributing the creative power evenly. One player can't dominate by the nature of the rules. It encourages collaboration. The ideas all go in the same pool, and the mechanics encourage you to combine them together. Players can negotiate with each other, right, by reintroducing resolved elements or even contradict the contributions of their partner. But because there's a limited currency of black stones compared to white stones, that kind of collaboration has to be the exception, not the rule. And the only way to keep doing it is by reverting to kind of going along with what your collaborator is suggesting and working with them. And finally, spending a stone to highlight an element is also a form of collaboration, right? You're communicating to your partner which elements of the story you're most interested in exploring further. So in this way, Plotkin's rules tell us not only what kind of collaboration the game expects, but also how to achieve it. And to me, that's really critical. The affordances and restrictions of the game rules are designed to help two people, probably strangers, right, just posting on this forum together, work together to create a story of a fixed duration with occasional surprising reversals and a satisfying resolution that ties up all the loose threads. So this is kind of what I mean by a minimalist collaborative story game. I think it really effectively demonstrates that you don't need a human game master or even a complex AI to manage an emergent story. And also, again, sort of points out that collaborative story games aren't just tabletop role-playing games. They include kind of this wider variety of interesting things. So I got into thinking about this stuff while working on a dissertation about how digital story games can be more expressive. And I kind of went down a rabbit hole of looking into analog collaborative story games and how they work and what they're doing. And these are actually pretty understudied in academia, I found. Most of the real kind of meaty design thinking about them has been done by practitioners. And this reminded me a lot of kind of the state of interactive fiction stuff 20 years ago. People were doing amazing things online in little forums, and people weren't really like studying this in a serious way yet. But one academic theory that I really liked that I found was by a fellow named Lars Konzak, who had a really interesting theory for how these games work. And one part of that was using this metaphor of the wunderkammer. So this is something that came from kind of a Renaissance era tradition of kind of building a cabinet and putting interesting objects within it. And the collection of objects is sort of presumed to stand in for some larger whole, which exists in the viewer's imagination, right? Like, why did these objects get collected together? What does the presence or absence of certain kind of objects suggest? And what Konzak, his description of this is, it's a microcosm of wonders that triggers imagination and ingenious thoughts as to the greater macrocosmos of which it is a representation. So Konzak draws a parallel between the magical space of the wunderkammer and the kind of idea space that collaborative story gamers create together in play. As objects or ideas are added to the world through verbal description, players are continually revising their concepts of the shared fictional universe that those items imply. So what's interesting about this, though, is that both humans and mechanical systems, I think, can add things to this sort of idea space, right? So for instance, if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, the system is essentially kind of, even just in its title, proposing two things that might go in your shared idea space, right? These are things you might be telling stories about. And what's already in the wunderkammer shapes how you interpret everything else that follows. So if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons and someone suggests adding a crystal skull to that space, You're probably going to be thinking, oh, this is probably treasure. How much can we sell this for in town? This is great loot, right? On the other hand, if you were playing Call of Cthulhu in a sort of creepy Lovecraftian thing, you'd be thinking, oh my God, this thing is cursed. Don't touch it, right? Like, what horrible secret does this hold, right? So the same object, but because of what's already in that idea space, you're going to interpret it very differently. So I really like this wunderkammer metaphor for thinking about how different activities people participate in while playing collaborative story games kind of work together. And eventually I kind of settled on my own set of 4 activities that I think can all be connected to this metaphor. I'm going to go through each of these and showcase an example game for each, but I want to posit that any of these activities, like I said, are potentially things that can be done by either humans or systems. So we'll get back to digital games in a bit, but kind of be thinking about that as we go through these. So the first of these I want to talk about is story writing. We've kind of been talking about this already. This is when you're rationalizing and explaining how the things in the wunderkammer of ideas fit together. And I specifically am spelling this right as in shipwright, right? This isn't just like throwing ideas out there. This is kind of artfully crafting them together into like this narrative whole, these disparate pieces, right? So in D&D, if you roll a crystal skull on a random treasure table, both the game master and the players are going to start rationalizing how it came to end up in this grubby troll horde, what that suggests about the fiction that you're operating within, right? And in traditional role-playing, it is usually the game master who's doing a lot of this, right? It's kind of their job to pull together all these story threads suggested by the game system, suggested by the players, and make that into a coherent story. But it's not required that there's one sole person in charge of that. So in Plotkin's journal writing game, right, there's an explicit mechanic for this, gaining a black stone for tying 2 unresolved story elements together. That's story writing when you're doing that. And that creative power can be distributed in a lot of different ways, as we'll see going forward. Humans are really good at story writing. We basically can't help ourselves. An example of this that I really love, this comes originally from a paper by Roger Schenck, is if I give you 3 words, right, Dr. Porsche and Hollywood, you will start imagining a character. You might start picturing him in your head. You might start making assumptions about his backstory. If I instead give you the 3 words, Dr. Volkswagen Bug, Tokyo, you're probably going to start imagining a different character who maybe looks very different, has maybe a very different backstory, right? A lot of you are doing this right now in your heads and you can't help yourselves. And I find that really fascinating. And I think good storytelling, collaborative storytelling games take advantage of the fact that people are so inherently good at this. We want to explain things, right, even if they don't seem to make sense. So story writing factors into all these things. I want to move on to generation, which is kind of before that, right? It's just the act of putting something in the wunderkammer of ideas, right? Suggesting that something might be part of the story. This seems simple, and we're used to thinking about people doing this activity in this kind of context, right? So when you're creating a character, suggesting things your character might do, running through a world or story that's been prepared by a game master, suggesting actions they might take in that world. These are all acts of generation, right? But the game systems do a lot of this too. So we've talked about how the name Dungeons & Dragons is doing 2 acts of this, right? But the whole rule book of Dungeons & Dragons and any role-playing book is really doing a ton of this. So the art is suggesting possible stories you might tell. The lists of classes and races and skills and abilities are all suggesting things that might be in your story. The map, the background, these are kind of all giving you ideas of things that you might collaboratively tell a story about together. But even less or more obscure parts of the rulebook, I think. So this is a table from the first edition of the D&D Dungeon Master's Guide, which was sort of famous for having all these like super obscure tables, right? And especially looking back on this, it's kind of laughable that someone would actually stop and like add an additional 2% chance because of like a particular thing, and you know, calculate all these things together. But really, what these tables are doing, I think, the numbers aren't important at all. What they're doing is they're suggesting things you could tell stories about, right? So they're saying, maybe you could tell a story about someone getting a parasitic infection, right? Or traveling through a damp swamp or high mountain pass or something. Or characters who get old and weak and can't fight off the forces that are trying to kill them. Or being crowded together aboard a long sea voyage. So every role-playing game is filled with these acts of generation, suggesting things to put in the shared collaborative space of the wunderkammer. For most games, though, this is just a suggestion, right? I want to talk about a game that goes further with this. So Juggernaut by Jason Morningstar is a live-action role-playing game that comes on a deck of cards. And the first few cards explain the rules. So the game is set very specifically on July the 3rd, 1950. The reason for that will become relevant in a moment. The player characters are locked in a room to test a top-secret government computer called Juggernaut that can supposedly predict the future. They have some different character roles they're assigned, so one player might be one of the designers of the computer, one might be a skeptical military general, and so on. At any time, a player can ask the machine for a prediction by triggering a sound effect that you can download on the game's website, and drawing a card from the rest of the deck, which are all predictions about the future. So some of them are kind of highly narrative charged to your specific characters, right? So on the 19th of October 1950, the People's Republic of China will enter the Korean conflict by sending thousands of soldiers across the Yellow River. Some of them might be narratively charged for the person who drew the card. On 2nd of January 1959, you will die of pancreatic cancer after a short illness. The interesting thing about the rules, though, is that they say that it is up to the players, without breaking character, to ensure these predictions are accurate and true. And this is academic for a lot of these things that are more in the future, right? But what gets really interesting is when you start drawing cards with predictions about what's going to happen on July the 3rd, 1950. On July the 3rd, 1950, after making it clear that you can easily resist Juggernaut's forecast, you will touch each person in the tabulation room on the shoulder. So regardless of what your character thinks of Juggernaut, whether it's bunkum or horrifyingly accurate, the rules dictate that every one of its predictions is correct and must come true. And you as a player have to do whatever you can to make them so. I'm going to read one more of these example Juggernaut cards. On July the 3rd, 1950, you will make a loud speech denouncing the Juggernaut program and suggesting the sorting machine be destroyed. The decision will be reached not to destroy the sorting machine. So what emerges from playing Juggernaut is almost inevitably this kind of bleak story reminiscent of a Twilight Zone episode, where the characters are struggling fruitlessly to rationalize what's happening to them as the computer's sometimes meaningless but relentlessly accurate predictions rip their beliefs about power and free will to shreds. It's a lot of fun. I recommend it. What Juggernaut's doing differently than most role-playing games is it's generating ideas, like many of them do, but it's also requiring that players incorporate them into the narrative. There's no human game master to try to expertly story-write these random pieces together, and that's exactly the point of this game, right? The characters are kind of at the mercy of this incomprehensible force that doesn't make sense to them, that they'll never understand, and that's exactly the kind of story the rules are designed to create. So incorporating content generated by a system into a narrative that humans are taking part of is obviously a big goal of procedural content generation in general. I'm not really going to get into this in full, but the one project I want to touch on is Emily Short's Annals of the Perugues, or Paraguays, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. This is a non-interactive travelogue of a strange fictional country. So it's a printed book, but generated with procedural text. And the generator was created by Short, but she used it in an interesting way, because a lot of projects like this, you will rewrite the generator over and over again and keep regenerating stuff until you get something you like and start there. Instead, what she did is she would generate something, like a particular region of this fictional country, add that to the book, then tweak the generator to make it better, and then generate the next region. So she would never go back and radically change the things that had already been generated. And what's interesting about this is she sort of writes about wanting the procedurality and the act of collaboration to remain visible. And she has this great quote like, this is why the system will occasionally come up with character names like Maria the Material, or have a character buy a polyester codpiece, or put up a pub called Sign of the Electoral Stallion. It would be possible to smooth out what is uneven here, but I choose not to. It is the fingerprint of my collaborator. And I really like this notion of choosing to collaborate with a digital system, right? Like, instead of treating it like a recommendation, treating it as like a required thing that you're going to make part of your story, which is something that humans do together when they improvise and say, yes, and let's roll with that, right? So let's move on to negotiation. This is basically discussions about what should or shouldn't go in the wunderkammer, clarifications about what someone meant when they proposed something for that, saying maybe we should tweak this a bit so it goes better with everything else. In my dissertation work, I found this really interesting study by Draken and Smith where they looked at transcripts of people playing tabletop role-playing games and looked at what each sentence people were saying was actually doing functionally. And they found that more than 40% of communication in tabletop role-playing games is about this kind of stuff, right? It's like, it's about saying, what did you mean by that? Or, no, that can't happen because of this, right? It's just kind of like negotiating to get this shared story space that everyone's on board with. And again, this is something that happens in all collaborative story games. And again, in Andrew Plotkin's journal writing game, there's an explicit mechanic for this of spending black stones to sort of push back against something your partner's done. But some games make this a more central part. We talked earlier about these kind of games without a game master, GM-less games. Typically, that game master is the one person adjudicating all negotiation, right? They have ultimate authority to say what goes in the shared idea space or not. But a lot of games have explored distributing that creative authority more evenly. And one of these in particular, Polaris, the full title is Chivalric Tragedy at Utmost North, because there is now a newer role-playing game called Polaris, but this is the one I'm talking about. Does a really interesting thing with negotiation. So this game is unique for many reasons, not the least of which is that your characters from the very beginning are doomed. The players in Polaris make characters who are knights defending a dying mythical civilization that lived at the North Pole in a time, beyond time, far, far ago. Your beautiful kingdom of ice and music is slowly falling into corruption under the influence of encroaching demons called the Mistaken that corrupt the people's hearts and destroy their world from without and within. So the rules encode a character arc for each knight that predestines them to eventually succumb to the Mistaken, falling in battle or becoming corrupted themselves. So for example, rather than having experience points that you use to level up and get more and more powerful, instead in this game you have a zeal score that every time you face an impossible fight or make a heartbreaking sacrifice goes down. And once you get to 0 zeal, you replace it with a weariness score that starts going up. And a character with a weariness score basically can die in a scene or fall to corruption or something. And in fact, when your weariness reaches your starting zeal, that has to happen. That scene becomes the final scene of your character. So an arc of tragedy is kind of encoded not only to the art and setting of this game, but the actual rules of it itself. So why do players roleplay their characters fighting back anyway, right? Well, it's for the same reason audiences are interested in any tragedy. We want to see how that fall happens, right? We know it's going to make a really good story. What I want to focus on in Polaris is a technique it uses for negotiation. So performative utterance is a kind of linguistic discourse act. It's a sentence that not only describes a given reality, but also changes the reality that the people listening to it believe in. So for example, I now pronounce you man and wife. If you're subscribing to this notion that someone can say that verbally, then that sentence is like making this thing true. More sort of basic examples is that like this meeting is now adjourned, or I promise to do that. And of course, a lot of things you say in your average role-playing game are performative utterances, right? By making statements, you're making things true in the fictional world. Like I hit it with my axe. But generally, though, like I mentioned, only the game master has the ultimate authority and might say, actually, no, you don't, because there's a kobold in the way or whatever, right? What Polaris does is it distributes this authority differently. So there's no game master in this game. Each scene you play centers around a particular character, who for that scene is called the heart. And they narrate their character being heroic, trying to overcome problems facing them and their kingdom. The person sitting opposite them is called the Mistaken, and their job is to challenge the heart in everything they're doing. So they play demons, they're fighting human antagonists, they even sort of play dark temptations within the heart's own mind. Basically, it's their job to make things go badly for the hero. But you don't have to just accept whatever your Mistaken says during a scene. The game provides a set of key phrases, which are performative utterances, that encode a kind of ritualized negotiation over what ends up happening in the story. So the whole game has 12 key phrases in total, and there are certain times we can use them. The most important one, though, is but only if. So a player can use this phrase to indicate that what the last player just said will happen only in the given conditions. This is primarily used by the Mistaken to complicate the heart's actions, adding a consequence to what might have otherwise been an uncontested victory. The first player might then up the stakes again with another but only if, right? So it's almost like a narrative bidding mechanic. If a player wants to accept everything that's been proposed, the good and the bad, they can say, and that was how it happened. They might give up on both their original intention, but also all of these complications by saying, it shall not come to pass. So I want to give an example of this because it's kind of hard to follow. This is an example of play from the rule book. And in this example, so there's a player named Paul who is playing the hero, and a player named Carrie is his Mistaken, and it's this kind of climactic battle with this opponent. So Carrie says, so you're fighting back and forth, he brings his sword down on yours, and it shatters into 1,000 pieces. Paul, but only if the central shard of the sword drives through his chest, pinning him to the spot forever. Carrie, but only if his blood seeps into the remnant, corrupting its people. Paul, whoa. But only if I die. Emily, wow, are you sure? Paul nods. Carrie, and that was how it happened. Paul, can I end this scene? And so it was that Merzum died, his corpse slumped over the demon he had imprisoned, their blood mingling together and tainting his home under a starless winter sky. And Rick is very impressed. So, so this is interesting if you look at what's happening here. Paul instead, at any point through this escalation, could have said, "It shall not come to pass," in which case none of these consequences would have happened. But his mistaken probably would have narrated his nemesis escaping if he'd done that, right? So presumably Paul chooses his death as a form of bait to his mistaken, right? A way of ensuring he gets what he wants, the death of his enemy, even at terrible cost to both himself and his people. So not all confrontations in Polaris are quite this dramatic, but the mechanics really encourage this kind of, I think, fascinating new kind of collaboration. The mistaken's singular focus ensures that one player is constantly thinking about how to complicate the narrative of another, and how to how to keep the tragedy going, basically, right? While the key phrases are driving players towards tough decisions between getting what they want at a cost or not achieving their goals. So really cool game. The last core activity I want to talk about is administration. And this is basically the structure of the wunderkammer of ideas itself. The rules for what can be placed there and when and by whom. This might seem to be the least interesting of these, but there's actually a lot of interesting things that can go here. So I want to talk about Apocalypse World, and specifically the sort of, this was an indie role-playing game that came out in kind of an open license that people could reuse and remix. And it spawned a whole bunch of games that are kind of collectively known as Powered by the Apocalypse. A lot of the best-selling indie story games of the last 10 years have been Powered by the Apocalypse games. It's so popular that there's actually significant backlash against it now for like being such a commonly used set of mechanics. So most of these games do have a game master, although this person is generally encouraged not to pre-plan scenarios in advance, but instead to react to what the players are interested in doing and exploring within the world. And Apocalypse World in particular is quite firm about this. It says if you're not doing that, you're not playing Apocalypse World. These games are noteworthy from a player's perspective, mostly because of a thing they have called moves. So a move is basically just a trigger and an effect. So for example, your character might have a move. When you enter an important location, you can ask the game master for one fact about its history because you have elven wisdom. This is kind of a nice simplification of a lot of things that happen in role-playing games. Some moves still do have dice rolls you make or abilities that you're checking, but generally it's kind of a lot more streamlined and makes these games easier to pick up and play than more kind of rules-heavy role-playing games. But what's really interesting to me is that game masters are also only supposed to act via moves. In fact, there are only 3 triggers game masters have for when they're allowed to do something. It's when everyone looks at you because they want to know what happens next. It's when the players give you a golden opportunity, which is something like, you walk into a room that you knew was trapped, or you punch the ambassador in the face, right? It's like, yeah, we know what's going to happen there. Or it's when they fail a die roll. And game masters have a specific list of effects they're allowed to do. And they're basically all narrative complications. So for example, inflict harm as established. If it's been established that there are angry ogres attacking, a pretty obvious way of inflicting harm is having one of them put their axe in the lead fighter. Offer an opportunity. If a player in this ogre fight misses a dodge roll, maybe the game master invents the detail of an ominous crack in the ground that they might dive into to avoid being axed, though there might be a serious consequence of diving headfirst into this unknown hole. So after every move, the game master is instructed to ask the players, what do you do? So explicitly, you're basically trying to get the ball out of your court as soon as possible and put the onus back on the players to keep telling the story. The point is not this exact list of moves, which varies between each Powered by the Apocalypse game, but that this is really kind of converting the art of game mastering into a reproducible science, an algorithm, you might even say. The move seems simple, but there's actually a ton of hard-won wisdom about how to game master a dynamic story that's responsive to player actions built into these moves and the system's other rules. So game mastering has often been considered a kind of quasi-mystical art that can't necessarily be explained or taught, but Powered by the Apocalypse really takes the opposite tack and makes it a form of administration, right? It's just part of the rules of how you play this game that effectively facilitates all the other collaborative story game activities, collaboration, negotiation, and story writing. So a game system can collaborate on a lot of different levels, right? It can provide the administrative structure for collaboration as empowered by the Apocalypse, can enable negotiation like in Polaris, can contribute to generation of ideas like in role-playing source books like D&D, or more aggressively like in Juggernaut's Force Predictions. It can require players to story write together like Plotkin's journal writing game, and refrain from trampling on their contribution like Tales of the Crystalist does. So I think these games all offer different solutions and strategies to the problem of turning regular everyday humans with no training into expert collaborative story gamers. So how do we apply this back to digital games? I just take a long drink and never finish. So let's look at our definition of collaborative story games again. The rules and the content of the story are both important to proceed. The participants are involved in creating at least some of the story content, and that creation is mediated by systems that are designed to make the story compelling. So I'm going to go through a couple of takeaways, I think, that I see from thinking about this stuff. So expressive input is something I've talked about a lot if you have followed my academic work. It's basically the notion that the player, a system with expressive input is one in which the player can express something unique as they play through your game. So it's hard to help tell a story when the only verb you have is shooting. It's hard to feel like a real participant in a conversation when you can only choose a couple options off a menu. I think some of the magic of tabletop story games come from the ways that players can unleash their full range of creativity rather than being reduced to just enacting the hero's pre-made actions or responses. And other genres of games outside of narrative-focused games definitely do this, right? So Opus Magnum that I mentioned earlier lets you build these like amazingly complicated machines to solve these problems, and you feel really like smart and creative for having built them. Any game that has sort of like a character creator or lets you build bases or whatever is letting you be expressive. We're less used to seeing this kind of thing in narrative games, although a lot of the people here at Narrascope I think are exceptions. This is a joke line I like from Thaumaturgy by Bob Bates. So a parser, right, is a way of letting players be more expressive, and there's a lot of other techniques that people here have explored. But you don't have to offer kind of a full parser or full natural language understanding or whatever, and all the problems those can have. There's a huge range of ways we can let players be more inventive, I think, in digital story games. So you can let players take the pieces of narrative and make something of their own with them. This is from a game of my own called 18 Cadence. You can use free-form text input in a totally different way than a parser, like in Sam Barlow's Her Story. You can build mechanics around interacting with text and understanding text. Heaven's Vault by Inkle is an incredible game centered around deciphering language. You can build kind of a database of stuff that the players can access, like in the Scribblenauts games, where you can feel creative in the ways you're coming up with unique solutions to problems. And even though I kind of bashed on choose your own adventure style games a minute ago, I think you can be expressive with those too. And this is another of my games, Hollywood Visionary from Choice of Games, where you are sort of building, it's a story of you being a movie mogul in the 1950s, and you're sort of slowly building up all these specifics about your movie. So even though you're just making discrete choices, over time, those kind of emerge into something that feels unique to yourself. So lots of different ways we can do this, right? My dissertation advisor, Noah Wardrop-Fruin, has this really elegant metaphor I like called textual instruments. And he was writing about this, which is not ASCII art of guitars, despite the illustration. He was writing in the context of sort of interactive digital poetry, and talking about how the difference between something where maybe you're just choosing from some preset options and actually sort of contributing something is if there's affordances there that let you feel like you're sort of playing this work, right? Like you would play a musical instrument. You're certainly limited by its affordances, right? Like a guitar has frets that only let you play certain sounds. But those also help you perform in the way that instrument was designed to perform. You can create something genuinely new and surprising with a guitar, even though someone else built the guitar for you. And similarly, we have seen, I think especially in more indie and experimental spaces, games that let you generally feel creative with the content they're giving you rather than just being put in one of a couple boxes. So what kind of textual instruments can we build in digital games that will help players tell their own stories within our worlds? I think that's a good thing for all designers here to think about. Expressive input implies expressive output, right? Computers often have a hard time communicating complex internal states too. This term also comes from Noah's book, Expressive Processing. Expressive output is basically when we can see authorial intent in some code that a person created, right? It doesn't come across as just a neutral algorithm. We can see something of the person who made that code in it. And of course, there's no such thing as a neutral algorithm, right? All software is expressing something, whether the creators intend it to or not. But there's things you can do both as a system designer and as an artist that make that expressivity more prominent. And in the context of story games, systems can often be pretty limited as to what they can express, right? If the only way your characters can express themselves is with a pre-recorded MP3 file, that limits what they can express. So we hit on procedural text earlier, and I think this is a really interesting solution to make systems more expressive. So if we take a static piece of text like this great Douglas Adams line, and try to make it more procedural in such a way that we're actually kind of encoding something about why that's funny into the text that gets chosen. This is a way of starting to give a system axes on which it can make contributions to the sort of shared narrative experience. And there's all kinds of things out here. Again, I don't have time to get in all this stuff, but generative text tools like Kate Compton's Tracery or Alison Parrish's generative text work and tools, or the work I'm doing with Character Engine at Spirit AI. These are all kind of pointing towards a world in which systems are more able to express emergent, dynamic story states. And working together, expressive input and output make this kind of really interesting possibility of having these sort of two-way conversations. We're getting into the spaces where really interesting collaborations can happen between a human and a computer, which is something that might seem difficult if you're just approaching that without diving into this stuff as much. Much as two humans might collaborate in a tabletop story game. Of course, the problem is how to find a language that all the participants can speak, whether they're silicon or human. Redistributing power among players in collaborative tabletop story games implies that all players are equally capable of participating, but that isn't really true of systems yet. So Brenda Laurel in her book Computers as Theater, which has already been mentioned in an earlier talk, yay, it's a fantastic book from 1991. She has this nice metaphor that she uses of common ground, right? Which is a shared metaphor that both humans and computers, a human and a computer can understand and manipulate together. So a computer might have a hard time understanding full English sentences. A human might have a hard time understanding machine code, but perhaps they can both be taught to understand what it means to move files around a virtual desktop, right? So common ground in a broad sense is something incredibly common to just our interaction with computing platforms at all. But again, it's really interesting to me to think about what common ground can we find in the space of collaborative story games on the digital side. I recently played Skyrim VR, and the lack of common ground was really rough to me because you're walking up to these characters who seem so realistic and it's awesome, and they're speaking to you, but you can't talk back to them. They don't notice if you're smiling. They don't appreciate your body language. They don't react if you walk right inside of them, right? You're not able to kind of participate with them in the world that is implied by the fact that you're both sharing this digital space. But they could, and I think they will as people start maturing these art forms, right? So things like mixed reality, we're teaching, the HoloLens has this ability to deeply understand spatial relations in the same way that people do, right? And we can imagine encoding these things like body language and stuff into these systems so that you could be sharing a space with the virtual character and feel like there's some kind of communication or mutual interaction happening. And I think we should be thinking about what other common grounds we can find where people and systems can work together to tell stories. So a lot of story game rules are encoding hard-won wisdom about how players can create a mutually supportive environment to tackle the kind of scary task of being creative and risky together, right? In my dissertation work, I actually traced this further back than these story games to looking at how teachers of very young children encourage collaborative play with blocks. I'm going to read you some tips from this particular book by Wellhausen and Keith. These are all tips about how to encourage preschoolers to collaborate together with blocks, right? But what's interesting is I think every single one of these is an idea for how you might build a system that collaborates with its human players to tell a story. So arrange a simple configuration of blocks and invite the child to copy your formation. Ask questions about what the child is building. Observe what elements the child seems interested in and find ways to help them make structures that make further use of those elements. Respond to the child's construction positively without judgment words like good or bad. So I'd love to see a computer role-playing game that notice you seem to be really interested in stories about archers and start actively supporting you in that effort, right? By making its own stories about archers, or by noticing that you have completed a narrative arc about archers by creating a problem and then solving it and then rewarding you, saying, right, good story. So the sky's really the limit here. I think, again, this is an example of wisdom that we're not used to thinking about, that people have already been looking in the stories of how do humans collaborate together, or how do we create these kinds of experiences? So there's a lot of, I think, meaty stuff here to unpack and research. This one's fairly simple. So one of the things you notice if you play a lot of indie storytelling games is that they tend to be about a broader range of subjects than digital games, even indie digital games. So for example, this is a new, just came out this year, tabletop role-playing game that is 2 different games based on the same rule set. Dream Askew is a game about playing a sort of queer communal society that's trying to rebuild itself after an apocalypse and come up with a new way of living and surviving. And Dream Apart is about playing the members of a Jewish shtetl in the early 20th century who are fighting forces, political forces, religious forces, mythical forces that are all kind of trying to disrupt their way of life. Neither of these are the kinds of stories that you generally see even in indie digital games. Another game I played recently was about playing women who were spies during World War II and got sent off on these missions and had like a 60% rate of being captured and killed by the Axis. So look more broadly for the kinds of stories you can tell. I think thinking about collaborative story games starts pushing us towards games that can be about other kinds of human experience than the kind of game verbs we're used to seeing. And I think a lot of the games in this space are kind of inspiring examples of how we can turn game design wisdom towards making new kinds of experiences and stories interactive. And we should be listening to that. So many of these games are proceduralizing story and dramatic structure in ways that haven't been relevant to digital games thus far because stories have been so fixed. As we move towards making story games more dynamic, we should recognize that there's a huge treasure trove of wisdom in analog story games about how to procedurally construct stories, build characters with interesting emotional conflicts, keep a spontaneous narrative moving forward. Robin Laws, who's been designing tabletop role-playing games for a long time now, has a really interesting book called Hamlet's Hit Points, where he goes through, a bunch of kind of classic works of literature and basically looks at them from a game design perspective of like, if these were actions available in a game world, like all through the story, what would they be? And how would that be represented? And he turned this into a game system called Drama System, and Hillfolk was the first game that came out with that system. That's all about basically understanding the emotional needs of all the player characters, and everything you're doing in a scene is making what he calls an emotional petition to another character. Like you're trying to get respect from that character, or you're trying to assert your authority. And that person then chooses whether they're going to grant or reject your petition. And this produces a game that's very much based around the way character conflicts work in traditional narratives. And that's really different than the kind of systems you normally see in role-playing games that are about whether you can hit it with your axe, right? As we start getting more cool AI systems or procedural content-generated systems that start letting us tell new kinds of stories, we shouldn't try to invent those things from scratch. We should realize that other people have been thinking about how to make those kinds of things interactive and dynamic and take note of that. So, in conclusion, if you're working on amazing new interactive story AI, think about what kinds of social systems and storytelling systems and human systems you want to hook up to it. Realize that other designers have been thinking about these questions for a while. And if you're making indie adventure games or interactive fiction, think about getting some friends together and trying some of these tabletop story games. Call it research if you like. That worked for me. If you're interested in playing a game that was inspired by a lot of this thinking, check out my game Archives of the Sky. If you're interested in sort of commercial applications of this, talk to me about Spirit AI. And if you're a graphic designer, John and Anastasia and I could really use your help with our book cover. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions. Right. So that's hard. I actually kind of skipped this in the talk, but in my dissertation, I have a whole thing about so actually doing this requires solving, things like natural language understanding and common sense reasoning and a lot of really hard computer science problems that people like you are working on. But it's really difficult, right? So to a certain extent, some of the stock is kind of looking forward to future decades when we have made more progress towards those problems. But I also think there's a lot of stuff that we can be doing now, right? I think part of that is about sort of carefully choosing the domain in which you're working. So I did a project quite a while ago now called Almost Goodbye that used procedural text generation, but only for certain kind of really basic kind of sentences, because I decided that those were the kind of sentences I could trust my digital collaborator to make, right? I didn't try to have it do dramatic character scenes or major exposition or whatever. I just had to do these really basic sentences like the sun glimmered off the waves, right? So that's one answer, I think, is being very limited in your scope.
Is the human limited to that same vocabulary? Because not only does the computer have to understand what it does,
right, and then like the common ground sense. Yeah. So that project didn't try to like understand things back, right? But yeah, I think that's definitely a solution, right? So like a lot of the successful things you see, like there's the Sherdlu project was a very early 1960s thing where humans and computers were both talking about this world of blocks on tables and able to communicate about what that space looked like. And that worked because that was an incredibly limited domain, right? I think we can find stories to tell in incredibly limited domains. We're not used to thinking of stories like that, but I think it's just kind of like another form of authorial constraint. So to me, that's kind of an interesting question is like, given the capabilities of a certain system, like what do we think we could tell a story about with that system, right? And then sort of building from there as the system gets more and more elaborate. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, like a really broad meta thing from this talk is like look more broadly in your inspiration for things, right? There can be, there are people solving similar problems in totally different domains, and it can be hard to like find those people and what they're doing, but there's a lot of, interesting work out there in all kinds of places. I recently was writing something about the game Kentucky Route Zero, and the designers of that were inspired by a military strategist in the first George W. Bush presidency who had this distinction between puzzles and mysteries. So he defined a puzzle as basically like a problem where you don't know the answer, but you can go out and find it. And a mystery is something that you're never going to be able to completely solve. And the creators of Kentucky Route Zero latched onto that and says, aha, we don't want to create adventure games with puzzles. We want to create adventure games with mysteries, right? We don't want the player to like actually be able to understand and solve all of this because they're telling a story about a world with people, who are facing the economic recession and things like that, and there are no easy solutions to those puzzles. So I think it's really interesting that that idea came out of this like very left field origin, right? So yeah. That's a good question. So to the extent that indie games that are still trying to like make a profit are in the equation, I think the broader games industry has a conception of what kind of stories are possible to tell. And if you're an indie trying to make a living, you're at least going to need to pay attention to that so that you don't make something that no one is going to be willing to pay for, right? So I think consciously or not, indies are going to kind of ape the conventions of digital games. Even outside of that context, though, I think a lot of it is just the tools that we have, right? Like in a tabletop storytelling game, you can just add a rule like come up with a cool name for a car, right? And humans can just do that. But if you make that part of your digital game, you have to build that whole procedural text generation system, right? So there's a lot of things that you can just rely on human brain power to do that we're not used to building systems to do yet. So I think it's harder to make games around those different kinds of verbs than we're used to making. So that's a big bottleneck. But again, I think it's not impossible, right? And a lot of it is just like, finding the right inspiration to start from to even, move games in that direction. Yeah. So I think. Like in this, even just in the set of games I talked about, there's a wide variety of approaches, right? There's games with game masters, there's games without game masters, sources of randomness, what's controlling where the story is going, if that's predetermined in advance, right? There's all these different sort of considerations. And I think those are all good for different kinds of stories, right? Another story game is Fiasco that I memorably played with Stephen late night at a conference once. Which is trying to make sort of like Coen Brothers style movies where a bunch of people get in over their heads and things keep going wrong and they get worse and worse. And I think a big reason that game is GM-less is because that kind of story feels like it's going totally off the rails and no one's in control of what's happening, right? That's not a kind of story where you want someone to pre-plan in advance what's going to happen. But other kinds of stories do work better with pre-planning, right? So I think tying it back to digital games, it kind of ties into that, right? And I think, again, because these tools are still nascent, we're not used to thinking about what kinds of digital stories should we give the players more power in. There was a game from maybe 5 years ago called Elegy for a Dead World, where you were exploring these kind of alien planets, And you could kind of basically leave little travelogues as you were going that lived in the world. And the game didn't sort of respond to those. It wasn't trying to do natural language understanding on them. But it was really interesting to play because it felt rare for a game to ask you what you felt about the places you were seeing in that kind of way, right? To verbalize those. And I think that kind of thing is an interesting step towards sharing the creative power a bit more than we're used to in digital games with the player. Stab at answering that anyway. Cool. I think that's time. I'm happy to talk with people after, but thank you for coming.